Classical music isn't meant for kids from the projects. Those words cracked through the silence of Maplewood Conservatory's grand hall like thunder. They came from Professor Leonard Price, a man whose reputation shone as brightly as the gold buttons on his tailored suit. Every note of his voice dripped with superiority as he stared down at 13-year-old Malik Rivers, a skinny, black boy clutching a scuffed violin case that looked like it had already lived 3 lifetimes. The chandelier light scattered across the marble floor as if mocking Malik's reflection. His shirt too big, his shoes too worn, his hope too fragile. 30 pairs of eyes followed every move he made. Students from rich families whispered behind expensive smiles. Board members leaned back in their velvet chairs, waiting for the spectacle they expected. A poor kid trying to play a rich man's music. Professor Price smirked. "Hey, maybe try something urban next time," he said, pausing for effect. "Something that fits your background." Laughter echoed, thin, cold, rehearsed, but Malik didn't flinch. He held the violin case tighter. Inside it rested the last thing his father ever touched. And he had 8 minutes to change the story. 8 minutes to make every one of those people swallow their laughter. 8 minutes to prove that greatness doesn't come from your zip code. It comes from your soul. Have you ever been told you don't belong, then dared to prove them wrong? That's what Malik Rivers was about to do. But to understand how he got here, you have to travel 3 hours back, to a place the world often forgets. The alarm in Malik's bedroom shrieked at 4:57 a.m. in a small apartment on Detroit's west side, where cracked windows let in more wind than warmth. The day began long before sunrise. The old heater groaned in protest as pipes rattled behind faded wallpaper. The ceiling was a map of old leaks and survival stories. Every stain was a memory. Every crack a line from a song nobody had time to finish. His mother, Lena Rivers, was already up. She stood in the kitchen in faded hospital scrubs, her hair tied back, her hands red from bleach and hot water. The smell of instant coffee filled the room, a poor man's luxury. Bills were stacked near the toaster like unopened threats. Next to them sat a glass jar labeled Malik's Music Fund. It held $3.26 in loose coins and a single dollar folded like a prayer. "Morning, Ma," Malik mumbled, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Morning, baby. You practicing before school again?" "Yeah, auditions today." Lena looked at him for a long moment, her exhaustion hiding behind pride. "Your daddy would have been proud." "You know that?" Malik didn't answer. He just nodded and reached for the violin resting in its worn case. The wood was dull, the bridge slightly uneven, and one string had been replaced with fishing wire last month. But when he raised the bow and pulled it across the strings, the room changed. The music filled every inch of that cramped apartment like sunlight slipping through broken blinds. It wasn't just sound, it was survival. Every note carried the story of who they were. His father, Marcus Rivers, had played that same violin at weddings, street corners, and bus stations. When he died, the violin became their inheritance, a legacy of rhythm and resilience. "Baby, keep it down," Lena said softly, though she smiled when she said it. "Mrs. Torres upstairs will start banging again." Malik grinned. "Then she can listen for free." Lena's laughter was tired but genuine. She poured coffee into 2 chipped mugs, one for her, one for him, though his had more milk than caffeine. Across from him, she adjusted the old photograph taped to the fridge. Marcus smiling wide, violin in hand, eyes full of dreams that never had the chance to grow old. "You nervous?" she asked. Malik set the bow down carefully. "A little. It's the biggest school in the city, Ma. Kids there, they got everything. You've got everything too," she said firmly. "You got fight. You got fire. And you got a father who taught you that music ain't about money, it's about truth." He nodded slowly, taking those words into him like armor. At 6:30, he stepped out into the freezing air. Snowflakes drifted under the flickering streetlight. The bus stop was empty except for a man asleep on the bench under a blanket of newspapers. Malik held his violin close against his chest like it might warm him better than his jacket. On the bus, people slumped in silence, heading to jobs they didn't love to pay bills that never stopped. A woman hummed softly to herself near the back. It wasn't in tune, but it was honest. Malik closed his eyes and tapped his fingers along to the rhythm, every heartbeat syncing to a melody no one else could hear. He imagined the marble floors of Maplewood Conservatory, the way the light must look through its crystal windows. He imagined the professors in their fine suits, the students with instruments that cost more than cars. He imagined stepping on that stage and making them all stop breathing. 8 minutes, that's all he'd have. 8 minutes to show them what it sounds like when pain turns into purpose. 8 minutes to play the sound of a boy who refused to disappear. The bus rattled to a stop in front of Maplewood Conservatory, its iron gates rising like a fortress. Malik stepped off, his shoes crunching on the salted pavement. The building looked like something from another world. Tall marble pillars, stained glass windows, and a carved stone archway that read, "Excellence belongs to the worthy." He swallowed hard. The air smelled like expensive cologne and polished wood. Inside, students moved through the halls wearing crisp uniforms and confidence like a second skin. Violins and cellos peeked out of shiny cases that gleamed like jewelry. Every sound echoed, heels clicking, laughter bubbling, voices that had never been told no. Malik clutched his old violin tighter. His shirt cuffs were too short, his tie borrowed from a neighbor. He caught his reflection in the glass door, nervous eyes, trembling hands, and whispered to himself, "Just breathe." Down the hall, Professor Leonard Price's voice carried like a sermon. "Punctuality reflects character," he said to a group of students clustered around him. His silver hair was neatly combed, his gold watch glinting under the chandeliers. Every word he spoke seemed measured, rehearsed, sharp enough to cut. When his eyes landed on Malik, a faint frown crossed his face. "You must be the scholarship applicant," he said, his tone flat. "Yes, sir," Malik replied. Professor Price looked him over, his shoes, his case, his nervous stance. "Well, let's hope your playing makes up for your presentation." The words hit like cold rain. The other students smirked. Malik nodded quietly, his jaw tightening. "Follow me," Price said, turning on his heel. They entered the grand audition hall. The room glowed under massive chandeliers, every chair polished, every inch of marble shining. A few teachers sat in the front row with clipboards, while board members chatted idly, sipping from porcelain cups. The smell of perfume and old money filled the air. Malik stepped onto the stage, the sound of his footsteps echoing louder than his heartbeat. He set down his violin case, his fingers fumbling with the worn clasps. From the corner of his eye, he saw Professor Price exchange a knowing look with a woman in pearls. "Tell us, Mr. Rivers," Price began. "What piece will you perform today?" Malik lifted his chin. "Bach's Partita in D minor." A small ripple of laughter moved through the audience. One board member muttered, "Ambitious choice." Price smiled thinly. "Ambitious indeed. Most of our students don't attempt that until their third year. But by all means proceed." Malik nodded. He took out his violin, the same one his father had played on their wedding day, the same one he'd practiced on since he was 7. The varnish was worn, the wood scarred, the tone deep and alive. Price leaned forward. "Is that your instrument?" "Yes, sir. It was my father's." "I see," Price replied with mock sympathy. "Well, perhaps you'll find our academy's standards rather demanding." Whispers circled the hall. Malik felt heat rise to his face, but his mother's words echoed in his mind. "You got fight. You got fire." He took a deep breath. "Thank you, sir," he said evenly. "But this violin has a story to tell." A hush fell over the room. For a moment, even the air seemed to wait. Malik lifted the bow, his hand trembling slightly. Then sound, it wasn't perfect. It wasn't polished. But it was powerful. The first note sliced through the hall like a blade of light, sharp and raw. The vibrations filled the space, crawling up the marble walls, wrapping around the chandeliers. Every corner of that room felt it. The board members stopped whispering. The students in the front row stopped smirking. Professor Price froze. Malik closed his eyes, letting the music take him back. Back to the nights when sirens cried outside their window. Back to the mornings when his mother's tired smile was the only sunrise he knew. Every stroke of the bow carried a memory, every chord a prayer. The melody rose fierce and alive until it wasn't just a song. It was defiance. It was a declaration. He played through every insult he'd ever heard, every doubt, every door that had been closed in his face. When the music softened, the silence that followed was electric. The only sound was Malik's breath, heavy and uneven. The audience sat stunned. A teacher in the front row wiped a tear before pretending to check her notes. But Malik wasn't done. He moved into the next section, the sarabande, slow and aching. The notes stretched like grief turned into sound. Each one seemed to ask the same question. Why should brilliance need permission? Lena's voice filled his memory again. Don't let anyone tell you your music isn't good enough. He didn't rush. He didn't flinch. He played until the sound became truth itself. Professor Price's smirk was gone now. He sat perfectly still, his hands clasped, his eyes locked on the boy who refused to fit inside his narrow definition of excellence. The final notes trembled into silence. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then another. The air hung heavy, charged. And then someone clapped. Slow, deliberate echoing. It was Dr. Clara Morgan, the Academy's founder, a woman whose name carried weight in every music hall in America. She rose to her feet, her applause growing louder, joined by others, faculty, students, even board members. Only one person stayed seated, Professor Leonard Price. Malik lowered his violin, his hand still shaking. He bowed once, steady, calm. "Thank you for listening," he said quietly. Dr. Morgan's voice cut through the noise. That, she said, was not just playing. That was truth. The applause swelled. Malik exhaled, feeling something inside him shift. But this was only the beginning, because the next few moments would change not just Malik's life, but the soul of the Academy itself. The applause roared through the hall until the chandeliers seemed to tremble from the force of it. Malik stood in the center of it all, small and still, his violin pressed against his heart. He didn't know if he should bow again or run. His eyes searched for his mother, but she wasn't there, just strangers rising to their feet, clapping like they'd just seen something holy. Professor Price sat motionless. His polished shoes gleamed under the light, but his expression had cracked. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't scowling. He was simply stunned. For the first time in years, Leonard Price had nothing to say. Dr. Morgan made her way to the front, moving through the standing ovation like a wave cutting through water. "Mr. Rivers," she said when the clapping finally began to fade, "you've just reminded this academy what music is supposed to mean." Malik's throat tightened. "Thank you, ma'am." Her voice softened. "Where did you learn to play like that?" He hesitated. "At home. My father taught me." Before he passed, the room grew quiet again. The echo of his words lingered in the marble air. Dr. Morgan nodded slowly, as if something heavy and beautiful had just landed on her heart. "Then I imagine he's very proud." Behind her, one of the board members whispered to another, "That boy just played like his life depended on it." The other replied, "Maybe it did." Professor Price stood at last. "That will be all," he said stiffly, trying to recover his composure. "We'll be in touch." His tone carried that same old arrogance, but it faltered under the weight of what everyone had just witnessed. Malik didn't respond. He packed his violin carefully, closed the case, and turned to leave. But as he reached the doors, Dr. Morgan called after him. "Mr. Rivers," he turned. "You didn't just audition today. You reminded us why this place exists." Malik didn't fully understand her words, but he felt them. Deep down, he felt them. Outside, the cold air hit him like a wave. He walked down the academy steps, his fingers still trembling from adrenaline. He could hear faint music from another room, a student practicing, notes too polished, too careful. He smiled to himself. His father's violin was warm against his chest, as if it knew what had just happened. By the time he reached the bus stop, his heart had finally slowed. He didn't know if he'd get the scholarship. He didn't know if those rich faces would ever remember his name. But he knew one thing. They would never forget the sound. Back inside the conservatory, silence lingered after Malik left. The faculty whispered among themselves, words like genius and authenticity, floating between rows of expensive seats. Dr. Morgan turned to Price. "You tried to humiliate him." Price straightened. You expected him to fail," she cut in. "You mistook poverty for lack of potential." Again, her tone was calm but deadly. "I built this place to find brilliance where no one else looks, and that boy just reminded me why I started." Price looked down at his hands. For the first time in his career, he felt something colder than embarrassment. He felt shame. That night, when the board gathered for dinner at the conservatory's private dining hall, the topic of Malik Rivers dominated every conversation. Some called him a prodigy. Others said it was luck. But Dr. Morgan said nothing. She just watched Leonard Price across the table, his fork untouched, his gaze distant. The next morning, her decision was made. She called Malik's mother. Lena was in the hospital cafeteria, halfway through a cup of coffee she couldn't afford. When her phone rang and she heard the voice on the other end, her hands began to shake so hard she nearly dropped it. "Mrs. Rivers? This is Dr. Clara Morgan, director of Maplewood Conservatory." Lena's heart stopped. Malik, did something happen?" Dr. Morgan smiled through the line. "Something wonderful. Your son has been accepted. Full scholarship, tuition, lessons, everything." Lena pressed a hand to her mouth, tears spilling before she could stop them. "Oh, thank God." "He earned it," Dr. Morgan said simply. "And Mrs. Rivers, your son didn't just pass an audition. He changed this academy." When Malik came home that evening, Lena didn't speak at first. She just pulled him into her arms and held on until he laughed, confused and breathless. "Ma, what's going on?" "You did it, baby," she whispered. You did it. The next few weeks passed in a blur. Reporters came. Photographers snapped pictures of the boy with the old violin and the shy smile. Headlines called him the kid who played his way out. Donations flooded the academy. New programs were proposed, ones that would seek out hidden talent from Detroit's forgotten neighborhoods, but the person most changed was Leonard Price. He watched Malik's video replay on the academy's website late one night, the sound echoing in his office. The boy's bow moved with a kind of freedom that no conservatory could teach. Price remembered his own childhood, how he'd been told he was destined for greatness, how he'd believed excellence belonged only to those with the means to buy it. He turned off the video and sat in silence for a long time. Then he opened a drawer, pulled out a letterhead, and began to write. "Mr. Rivers, I owe you an apology." He didn't finish it that night. He didn't know how to put into words what the boy had shattered inside him. And yet, this was only the beginning, because within a few months, Malik Rivers would return to that same marble hall, but this time, not as an outsider. He would return as the boy who made an empire of arrogance fall silent with a single note. He would return to play again. And this time, the world would be listening. By the time spring sunlight began to melt the last of Detroit's snow, Malik Rivers had become the name whispered through the marble corridors of Maplewood Conservatory. Some called him the boy with the broken violin. Others called him the miracle from the West Side. But for Malik, none of that mattered. He still caught the early bus every morning, violin case in hand, heart full of gratitude and fire. His days were long, scales, theory, rehearsals, but he carried every hour like a gift. His classmates had started to change around him too. The same students who once smirked at his frayed cuffs now leaned closer when he played, studying the way his bow seemed to breathe with him. They had technique. He had truth. He still sat in the back of class, quiet and observant, but his presence pulled the room's gravity toward him. Even the air seemed different when he tuned his strings. Professor Price avoided him for weeks. He taught his lectures with clinical precision, pretending not to notice the boy who had overturned his certainty. But every time Malik raised his bow, Price felt something twist inside him, a mix of regret and wonder. Dr. Morgan, meanwhile, had begun a new initiative, the Rivers Scholarship Program. She stood before the board and said, "If genius can emerge from one small apartment on the West Side, then how many others are waiting in silence? Let's find them." Her words sparked murmurs that soon turned to applause. Funding poured in. Applications flooded the office from every corner of the city. Malik didn't know any of that yet. He only knew that the academy no longer felt like enemy territory. It felt like a place he could claim. He started making friends, real ones. Among them was Eli Parker, a cellist with golden hair and too much confidence. "Man," Eli said one afternoon during practice, "I've been trying to play Bach's Allemande for months." "You played it like you were breathing." Malik laughed softly. "I was just trying not to mess up." Eli shook his head. "You don't play not to mess up. You play to make people feel something. That's the difference." For the first time, Malik realized what his music had done. It had changed people without him even trying. He practiced late into the nights, the glow from his dorm window visible across the quiet courtyard. Sometimes Dr. Morgan passed by after evening meetings and paused just to listen. The sound wasn't just notes, it was gratitude, grief, and unspoken dreams woven together. Weeks turned into months, and then came the letter. The Detroit Symphony Youth Orchestra was holding auditions. The same stage where his father once dreamed of performing would now open to new musicians. Dr. Morgan encouraged him to apply. "You're ready," she said. Malik hesitated. "What if they think I don't belong there either?" She smiled gently. "Then you remind them again." He practiced harder than ever. His fingers bled. His bow frayed. He played until he could hear the notes even in silence. When the day came, the hall looked even larger than he'd imagined. The judges sat in shadow, their expressions hidden. Malik stepped onto the stage, his violin, still patched, still humble, gleaming faintly under the lights. He began to play. The sound was different now, bigger, freer, like the city itself had lent him its heartbeat. Each note rose like a prayer for everyone who'd ever been told they were too small, too poor, too different to matter. When he finished, the silence was familiar, the same heavy pause that had followed him once before. And then the applause came again, strong, unstoppable, rising like a tide. He was accepted that afternoon. Back at the academy, word spread fast. Students crowded the hallway congratulating him. Eli lifted him off his feet in a bear hug. Even some of the professors clapped him on the shoulder. But the real surprise came later that evening. As Malik was packing up his violin, the door to the practice room opened. Professor Price stood there, his expression unreadable. "I heard the news," he said quietly. "You'll be performing with the youth orchestra." Malik nodded. "Yes, sir." Price stepped closer. His voice softened. "I wanted to say, I was wrong about you, about a lot of things." Malik said nothing. "For 30 years, Price continued, I've taught students to perfect their sound, but I never taught them to mean it. You reminded me that music is supposed to start here." He placed a hand over his heart. Malik looked at him, unsure whether to speak. Finally, he said, "My father used to say the same thing." Price gave a small, weary smile. "Then maybe we both had good teachers." From that day forward, everything changed. Price began mentoring Malik, not out of pity but respect. He helped him refine his technique, explaining each phrase with patience that shocked the faculty. Students started to notice. It wasn't just Malik who was growing, it was the entire academy. Dr. Morgan watched it unfold with quiet satisfaction. The boy who came to audition for a scholarship had become the heart of Maplewood. As summer approached, the academy prepared for its annual gala, a tradition of polished recitals, elegant donors, and safe performances. But this year would be different. Dr. Morgan made a simple announcement. "This year's closing performance will be given by one of our youngest students, Mr. Malik Rivers." Gasps filled the room. It wasn't just a concert anymore. It was history waiting to happen again, and this time the whole city would be watching. The night of the gala arrived under a sky the color of deep brass. Cars lined the driveway of Maplewood Conservatory, headlights cutting through the mist as the city's elite stepped out in silk and tuxedos. Inside, champagne glasses clinked, violins were tuned, and the scent of roses drifted through the lobby. The marble hall glittered brighter than ever, but there was a hum beneath the glamour, a whisper that something extraordinary was about to happen. Backstage, Malik stood alone with his violin. His palms were slick, his throat dry. The chatter of the crowd seeped through the heavy curtain. He thought of his mother sitting in the front row, of all the mornings she'd woken before dawn, of the jar on the kitchen table that had never filled. He thought of his father's cracked fingers guiding his first notes. He thought of Professor Price, who had become a quiet shadow at his lessons, never missing a day. The lights dimmed. The announcer's voice echoed, "Performing tonight's closing piece, Bach's Partita in D minor, Mr. Malik Rivers." Applause began, polite at first, then swelling. Malik stepped into the light. He could feel hundreds of eyes on him. The chandeliers above seemed to breathe. He lifted his violin, feeling its familiar weight settle against his shoulder, and drew the bow. The first note trembled into the air, pure, haunting, alive. It filled the vast room, climbed the columns, curled under the balconies. He let the sound expand until it touched every corner, until even the most distracted donor in the back stopped whispering. Every movement of his hand seemed to tell a story too large for words. His father's funeral, his mother's exhaustion, the small victories hidden in ordinary days. The music swelled. He played the courante, swift and daring, his bow leaping like lightning. Each phrase carried both defiance and grace, every crescendo a reminder that beauty doesn't ask permission. Faces in the audience changed. Stiff expressions softened, eyes glistened. Even those who had never known struggle felt it through the sound, an ache, a longing, a light. When he reached the sarabande, time slowed. The notes fell like tears, gentle but unstoppable. Somewhere in the front, Lena pressed a hand to her mouth. Professor Price leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his lips parting in disbelief. He had heard perfection in his career, but never truth like this. Then came the giga, the final storm. Malik's bow danced faster than breath, faster than fear, faster than reason. Every measure rose higher, brighter, wilder, until the hall itself seemed to pulse with his heartbeat. When the last chord rang, it didn't fade, it lingered, trembling, alive, until silence claimed it. The world froze. Then came the applause. First a single clap, then a wave, then thunder. People rose to their feet. Some shouted, some cried. Lena stood sobbing openly. Laughter mixed with tears. Dr. Morgan was clapping hard enough to shake the stage. Cameras flashed like fireflies. And in the second row, Professor Price rose slowly, his hands coming together, applause echoing above all the rest. When the noise finally softened, Dr. Morgan took the stage. "Tonight," she said, "we have witnessed more than talent. We have witnessed a reminder of why we began teaching music in the first place." She turned to Malik. "Your scholarship is no longer a question. It's a promise. And beginning next term, Maplewood Conservatory will open a new division, the Marcus Rivers program, for gifted students who need only a chance." The audience erupted again. Lena covered her face, trembling. Professor Price walked to Malik after the crowd began to disperse. "You were magnificent," he said simply. Malik looked up, meeting his eyes. "So were you," he replied. And the two smiled, teacher and student equal at last. Months later, the program brought in dozens of young musicians from neighborhoods like Malik's, the halls filled with laughter and accents that had never echoed there before. Price ran the classes himself, gentler now, slower to judge. Dr. Morgan's health began to fade, but she said she could rest knowing the future was in good hands. Years passed. Malik performed around the world, Vienna, Tokyo, New York, but he always came home. The crack in his father's violin had been repaired but left visible, a small line of memory running through every note. And one night, standing at the same hall where he'd once been told he didn't belong, he lifted his bow again. The applause was already beginning before he even played. He smiled, took a breath, and let the first note fly. It was no longer the sound of defiance. It was the sound of everything that had survived.